Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00, and today let's continue our points of note for the Halo series. In this episode, we look at episode 5, Reckoning. Let's get into it. We start off with footage of John's early life on Eridanus II. It obviously differs fundamentally from the established lore, but then it would because it's a slightly separate canon timeline. In this, a younger Dr. Kwan and Halsey and Jacob Keyes are posing as parents looking to put their child into a school. This is when they come across John for the first time. John is on a climbing frame with other children. One of them is shaking the climbing frame, slips, loses footing, and nearly falls. John, much smaller than this other child, grabs him by the ankle with one hand and holds his entire weight, managing to pull him back up to safety. In the original lore, it was actually that John was playing a version of King of the Hill. He was stood at the very top and was at least a head taller than practically every other child nearby and was much more physically developed. He was also much more physically dominating. In fact, I would argue he was borderline a bully. Nevertheless, it's nice seeing a reimagining of the first encounter with a young John. Obviously, these differences were already manifesting in that he was already strong enough to hold the weight of an entire child with just one hand, but I digress. Onwards from this, it's evident that Keyes is completely aware of what happened to John and played a part in the process. Now, this is obviously very similar to the originally established lore. Yes, Keyes was there with Halsey during her investigation of these children, but he was there more as a military liaison or security detail. In this, it seems fundamentally different, but that becomes more evident slightly later on, so we'll touch base on this again shortly. Again, we're given Kwan and Soren's story. It continues to be relatively uneventful. However, I am pretty sure her storyline is the primary world-building story arc. In the 5 episodes we've received so far, not a massive amount has happened in Kwan's storyline, but what Kwan's storyline has enabled is huge levels of world building. We've seen new locations, we've seen the rubble, we've seen Madrigal, we've seen new factions, new worlds, new cities, new people of power, and they seem to be displayed through her storyline. So while I can understand some people are looking at Kwan's storyline and can't really get invested in it, I think as a narrative tool, as a storytelling tool, her storyline is the major world building, and I'm sure in one regard or another, and I'll touch on why later on, that her storyline will become suddenly much more important. Ultimately, she's an insurrectionist, she's trying to liberate Madrigal from the UNSC and trying to take up, so to speak, her father's crown. This may actually become more important later down the line, and by later down the line I mean seasons, series down the line, not necessarily episodes. But again, we'll circle back. First time Halsey even acknowledges her daughter, she almost immediately dismisses her intellectual addition to the conversation, which doesn't exactly bode well. The characterization between Halsey and Miranda has always been strained, even in the original lore. But here it's painfully obvious that Halsey just doesn't want to give her the time of day. And quite honestly, while Miranda is still seemingly attempting to prove herself, almost in the eyes of her mother, I think it's more so a professional courtesy, so to speak, that she wants to be acknowledged for her achievements, which are remarkable by any extent of the imagination. Next, we move on to getting prepped for removing the artifact from the soil, and Vanek's characterization is much more stoic and in line with perhaps gameplay expectations of a Spartan. But the thing is, a true Spartan is not just a killing machine or a master of war, but also they're highly intelligent, creative, and strategic in a tactical sense. Questioning certain things is an immensely important part of being a Spartan. Vanek's lack of desire to even question is ultimately limiting him as a Spartan, likely due to the hormone implant. Ultimately, this was even touched upon in Halo Reach, where Halsey called out Carter's judgments and following orders as being something that a Spartan perhaps shouldn't always do. She asked if he was a puppet or a Spartan. So while I appreciate some people's consideration that Vanek is sort of more in line with what you'd expect a Spartan to be, I disagree. But again, it's because of some fundamental differences perhaps in the characterization of Spartans from the games versus the characterization of the Spartans from the books. But again, I've got another video in the pipework for describing and discussing that at length. Next, we find John finding out about Kai's pellet removal, and it's an interesting and conflicting moment. Both Chief and Kai should be emotionally compromised, and yet Kai seems more emotionally awake than Chief. This could just be a basis of his base personality. John, by nature, may be more stoic, while Kai is more emphatic. Perhaps John is reading this emotion, the fact that she's nearly in tears when she's discussing it, and decides that she isn't in the right mental frame to be going into battle, while John himself is a little bit more collected and reserved. Nevertheless, Kai retorts with a conflicting argument. If she isn't fit for battle, he shouldn't be either. Cortana somewhat supports Kai's outspoken nature towards the Chief, and there's a little witty response from Cortana, which is actually very in line with Cortana's sense of humour nonetheless. As we move on, it's more or less beyond reproach that the two artifacts are undoubtedly meant to be connected. There's a hole missing in the centre of the larger artifact, which would perfectly fit the Madrigal artifact. But I think the link goes further than just a physical connection, stemming back to the metaphysical connection to the domain. This would also explain why Marquis was able to sense the location of the other artifact, due to the cave on Madrigal having embedded fauna technology that ultimately links to the domain. At least that's the running hypothesis that I've got again in another video that I'm currently writing. And I've touched upon it in a previous points of note, where this technology kind of embedded into the stone is again very fauna and has been seen before beneath Castle Base on Reach in the books. I don't think it's so much a telepathic kind of connection as I've seen some people mention, but more so that Reclaimers are simply influenced by and fed information from fauna artifacts that awaken phased stages of their gene songs, again as is covered in the books, particularly the Fauna trilogy. Also, I noticed that I'm referencing a lot of the established lore versus this new Silver timeline, and while on this point I completely understand the clear separation of the Silver timeline and the mainline lore. However, just because there is a separation doesn't mean there aren't very clear parallels, so while I will reference the established lore in the books and the games when talking about the Silver timeline, it's more so just to add context perhaps to where these particular scenes or narrative directions came from, as opposed to literally drawing direct links from one to the other and implying at least that the Silver timeline is the mainline timeline. That's not what I'm doing. We move on and we find Chief talking to Captain Keyes about the fact that Halsey's been lying to him. Now again, Chief's resentment of the kidnapping and his decision to lash out effectively is being motivated by being lied to since day one, versus, for example, in the books, where the choice was made to tell them the truth from the get-go to avoid complications of the truth coming out and causing resentment. This narrative difference is a primary driver behind the continued storyline development. Keyes is obviously lying to Chief about looking into his kidnapping. It's actually very obvious. Again, despite the original lore having Keyes reassigned before the program really kicked off, Keyes evidently figuring it all out and being able to keep a secret, and his involvement with Halsey saw him being moved away to keep his hands clean. In the TV series, it is extremely evident Keyes had an active role in the Spartan program. Keyes also strikes me so far in the 5 episodes that we've seen him to be a composite character more so than just a singular re-representation or reimagination of Captain Keyes. He's a composite character in the TV series because there's a lot of characteristics or a lot of roles he's playing simultaneously. Now obviously he's definitely Keyes. He's definitely a captain of the UNSC Navy. He's the ex-lover of Halsey and father of Miranda Keyes. That's all just perfectly parallel. But he also fills other roles, and you may have noticed this as well. His early and continued involvement with the Spartan program also makes him somewhat a senior Chief Franklin Mendez kind of character, being the man who literally trained the Spartans since their conscription. And the fact that they've fought side by side for many years, he also seems to be filling the role of Sergeant Avery J. Johnson, being a brother in arms with the Chief and fighting by his side in many engagements, building something of a friendship over the years. But again, we're about to touch upon exactly why the lies are going to actually be a major continued storyline development mechanism, especially going forward into future seasons. And this comes into place when you consider what else is going on surrounding the Spartan program and Chief remembering aspects of his conscription. For example, Halsey blackmailing of the Office of Naval Intelligence and Margaret Parangosky also reveals that Lord Hood is complicit in some regard to the Spartan program, and thus the war crimes, the child trafficking, kidnapping, illegal flash cloning procedures, illegal human augmentation procedures, and likely a dozen more moral and ethical violations of the mortal dictator common law of the UNSC and the UEG. This growing complexity reveals a possibility that should Chief come to the conclusion that Oni and Halsey are an enemy of his, it will involve him rising up against Halsey and Oni, but that also means him rising up against the UNSC, the UEG, Hood, Keyes, basically almost all of humanity. He will become the traitor he was painted to be in Halo 5's advertisement, and will go on a morally justified war against, well, all of them, while saving and liberating the insurrectionists from UNSC rule and bring about something of a new world order, possibly even led by Spartans. Now, this is way down the line, but if this TV series wants to have legs and keep going for season after season, rather than just being... I know we've already got the confirmation that Season 2's already been greenlit and approved, but do they want a Season 3 or a 4 or a 5? Do they want to have 8 seasons, 10 seasons? Do they want this to really go the distance? And if they do, it makes sense that they'd lay the narrative groundwork, so to speak, to enable their story to go in lots of different directions. One, to keep people watching on their toes and wondering what's going to happen next, but also not to bottleneck themselves into a certain narrative storytelling. These kinds of storylines will keep things fresh moving forward. So sowing these seeds as early as possible bodes well for the future possibilities. Like I said, if they actually take something of an inspiration from how well received the Halo 5 marketing campaign was, and the Hunt the Truth podcast series, the audio drama, that was really well received by the public. And yes, when Halo 5 launched, it wasn't quite what we expected. It was actually very far removed from what we expected. But if they're looking at how positively the fans responded to that kind of a narrative, and the possibilities of the different storylines that could be told as a consequence, that makes a lot of sense to factor at least the possibility of going in that direction into the very early bare bones of the TV series. I would love to see Chief become that quote-unquote traitor. I said way back in the day that if Chief was going to become a traitor, if he was going to be hunted, if Oni were going to paint him as, you know, a fallen Spartan, a traitor to the UNSC and humanity, and he was going to be pursued, I am all for fighting in Chief's boots against other humans, against other Spartans, either with lethal force or less than lethal force. I don't know exactly, but nevertheless, I'm with him. I want to see that storyline take place. This seems like that's what's happening. Chief saved Kwan in the first instance when he started questioning things. Chief has been consistently questioning things since. Kwan's storyline is still edging along towards this whole idea of taking up our father's position, so to speak, and liberating Madrigal. And we've got these lies emerging and Chief becoming ever more uncomfortable with the situation he's finding himself in. I would love next season, the season after that, maybe even way down the line, to see Chief finally rise up or something along those lines against Halsey, Oni, UNSC, UEG, and become humanity's Spartan, not the UNSC's poster boy, but become motivated and pushed forward by the masses of humanity, as opposed to being given orders. I want to see that Hunt the Truth Chief be born. That would be fantastic. I went off on one there a little bit, but let's get back onto the storyline here. Now, we next see the artifact create some sort of resonant burst that causes the humans nearby to shy away, effectively, just due to how painful and uncomfortable it is. I can't tell if the sound emitted was a defense mechanism to keep unwanted species away, or if perhaps the laser breached the crystalline casing and the artifact responded by generating a powerful resonant frequency to free itself from the crystalline casing, because the sound stops almost immediately upon the casing actually falling away. So one would assume that's exactly what it was doing. Also, when Chief is questioning Cortana about why there's no information regarding the origins of the Spartan program, you can hear her tone, and, well, it's evident she's curious. In fact, I'd argue it's even inquisitive. Now, this is interesting because that curiosity could be the beginnings of a connection between Chief and Cortana, where she helps Chief figure this all out and begins to assemble exactly what happened, and then she makes her own decision alongside the Chief that what happened to him was wrong. It may have been necessary, but it was wrong. And once that conclusion has come to, Cortana will then start to work with Chief rather than what is effectively happening at the moment. She's working partially with him, but kind of more against him. She's working with him for the benefit of Halsey, which is also evident in the following scenes, where, being emotionally compromised with the fact that he realizes that he was kidnapped and how devastating that must have been to him, the red mist descends and he falls into a rage. And while it's completely justifiable, if you suddenly found out that a person who'd been saying to you all these years that they'd rescued you and they'd given you a purpose and they'd trained you and built you up as a human being, if you suddenly found out that this person that you trusted to the nth degree stole you away from your family, replaced you with a flash clone when it wasn't necessary, and then lied to you, told you that the colony suffered from some sort of plague or something along those lines, and ultimately the conclusion you come to there is, great, my family are dead. Well, yeah, anyone would be justifiably rage-filled and devastated. So Chief is emotionally compromised. He does go into a red mist rage almost, but the lunge, for what I assume was going to be a punch, was perhaps the wrong way to have Chief lose his temper. It just didn't feel right. Chief just suddenly screaming, battle crying, and lunging across the cave to punch Dr. Halsey, I assume. It just didn't sit quite right. Now, charging her, rather than, I suppose, Superman jumping and going to punch a lot, charging her would have made a little bit more sense. I'll be honest, just walking towards her, slowly and deliberately, until he's within the distance where he could lash out, would have been way more predatory, much more tension building, and still have the same emotional effect at the apex of that confrontation, resulting in his shutdown. That moment that he loses his temper and he's within reach, and he goes for her, and then at that apex, he is then shut down. That would have been much more, well, like I said, predatory. That would have been a much more powerful scene, but we got what we got. Wasn't great on it, but it is what it is. Although, while we're on that point, it is what we got. Now, if the intention was to actually lunge and punch her with rage, well, had Chief actually made contact with that punch, Halsey she'd be dead. That's it. Simple as that. Dead. Flat out dead. He'd have damn near punched a hole clean through her, to be quite honest. A single punch from Chief immediately after augmentation to unarmoured, fully grown ODSTs. Bearing in mind he's not wearing armour either. Caved in skulls, fractured sternums, instantly stopped hearts. And yet here he's well past augmentation and wearing Mjolnir Mark 6. I mean, he would have literally just punched a hole through her. Nevertheless, moving on to the centrepiece of this episode, the fight scenes. Seeing a destroyer go down was absolutely awesome, but I'm unsure how exactly that happened from just banshee fire. I thought our ships were a little tougher than that. Also, duly note that there are 2 Spartans carrying the artifact. Just keep this in mind, it becomes important later. We next see the sprinting scene. Now, I did some basic eyeballing and calculations of the running scene with the Spartans running alongside the Warthog and factored in the Warthog's law length of approximately 6 meters, timing how long it takes for a Spartan to run approximately that distance. And we actually arrive at travelling 6 meters in about 0.4 seconds, making their speed 15 meters per second. Converting that to a velocity we're familiar with, that's 33.5 miles per hour or 53.9 kilometers per hour. This is fast. Well, it breaks the sprinting world record anyway, but it's nowhere near the fastest a Spartan can actually sprint. But it's still awesome to see though. They got the stride and the gait of the runs perfect to showcase the Spartan's size, power and speed. If they got this wrong in either direction, they'd either look like they were bounding down the road or taking really fast, really tiny little steps and looking more cartoonish, so props to them for that. Running and gunning is also great to see. I like to see that the HUD changes colour based on if the Spartans are in combat or not, with orange being the colour of the combat HUD and blue being the quote-unquote normal HUD. The super combined kill with the Needler was horrifically lore accurate, ripping the body apart completely due to the violence of the resonant explosion between the needle shards. It's just... wow. For why that actually happens, by the way, I've actually made an armory video on the Needler. There's a link in the description, so if you want to find out, video's down below. We see Miranda's Condor get shot and blown up, and we see Halsey, for once, showing some concern for her daughter. Had to happen sometime, right? Next, we have the scenes regarding Kai and ultimately proving Chief right in that Kai was not in the right emotional frame of mind to be on the battlefield. But you see, Kai's emotional reaction to the horror of war is as direct of a consequence of not experiencing this aspect of war before. Spartans, soldiers in general, should and are trained to understand and handle the fog of war. It's a chaotic environment, but training puts emphasis on acting, muscle memory, and responding instinctually to unfolding events. Having feelings, emphatic reactions, and emotions suppressed through all of this training means that while they have been trained, they've never had to actually implement the training while they're also feeling all of the grotesqueries of the battlefield. It's important that they would feel that at the same time as being trained to work against it. Particularly in Kai's case, she was moved almost to tears about the idea of just feeling emotions and being awake when talking to Chief before the battle. This suggests she's more of an emphatic person anyway, so suddenly being confronted with the fog of war, the blood, the gore, the injuries, and losses of fellow soldiers, you'll notice there's even brief moments where her HUD is showing up information about soldiers nearby that are suffering particular injuries. This basically stems back to Mjolnir's ability to kind of read what the Spartan wants to know from a situational awareness standpoint and display that information ad hoc. Well, in that instance, Kai was paying a lot of attention to her fellow soldiers being injured, and Mjolnir was giving her the data, making her anxieties worse. Tie all of this together with the emotional and sensory turmoil that comes with it, it was just too much for her. Finally, Chief goes Spartan beast mode. See, Chief is on the opposite end of the spectrum to Kai. His natural stoic personality is making sense of the battlefield and kicking his training into action more so than Kai's more emphatic approach. His actions are unequivocally emotionally motivated because he won't let Kai die and will do what he has to prevent it. The immensely powerful dive through the air and then colliding with a Banshee was just a moment of awe for me. You'll also notice that Chief actually guides the Banshee's flight by grabbing the Banshee's wing and pulling it down. This changes the angle of attack due to the Banshee's primary repulsion drive thrusters being mounted on the wingtips. The Carter-style collision takes down the Phantom and plenty of enemies nearby. That was awesome to see, and John's Mjolnir armor made sure that he survived it. Again, the gore involved here with, for example, the Jackal missing its lower body almost entirely is oddly satisfying to see in Halo, given that the lore of Halo and how war should be portrayed is, well, very gory. So to finally see this sort of stuff actually happening in Halo is oddly satisfying, really oddly satisfying. The fight scene that follows is beautifully laid out. It's beautifully executed with a nice, long, single, continuous camera shot showcasing how a motivated Spartan can move through and dominate a battlefield. Even the subtle attentions given to, for example, keeping the Marine clear and pushing him back down to keep him safe and out of Chief's line of sight is exquisite. Also, subtly noticing Chief pulling a knife from somewhere. I don't know where. I don't know if it's his knife or he picked it up from somewhere on the battlefield or relieved it off of an enemy. But it seems to be a backward curved blade. He uses several times and then throws it. And at the climax of all of this, Chief finally unleashes Spartan Rage. He goes in for hand-to-hand combat with an elite, outpaces, overpowers and outmaneuvers the elite, getting it on the ground and then literally unloading bone-crushing force punches over and over again, caving in the elite's skull and finally curb-stomping him. I love this scene for a few reasons. First, the gratuitous violence, obviously. Second, the emotionally motivated Chief unlocking Spartan potential. That was fantastic to see. The demonstration of how a Spartan dominates practically every battlefield engagement and driving home the idea that while most of the Covenant think of humans as weak, pathetic and vulnerable, a Spartan physically overpowers and dominates an elite, the backbone of the Covenant military, like it's nothing. And finally, the facial expressions that Pablo manages to portray here in those instances, and those subtle camera zooms as each punch lands, along with the sound of the bone-crushing force, just, again, gratuitous violence. I like it for that. Finally, we get our first look at a brute. Chief has evidently encountered brutes before because he reacts by doing what he can to block the ultimately impending hammer attack. He picks up a jackal shield and uses it to almost up-armor himself to that particular attack. This brute is huge, powerful and fast, much more akin to how they are in the books. Chief's first encounter with a brute, for example, in First Strike, he was very nearly choked to death. A brute grabbed him by the throat, pinned him to a wall, and literally just nearly squeezed the life out of him. It was only because he waited for his energy shields to recharge a tiny amount to create some repulsion between the brute's grip and his throat that he could then coil his body up and kind of spring himself out of it and then go about attacking the brute. So seeing a brute this size, this powerful, this dangerous is, yeah, very, very, very in line with the lore. Bearing in mind this thing uses his hammer to bring the artifact to him, and then he holds it in one hand with no effort. Now, we saw two Spartans carrying that thing between them earlier on, and yet this guy is just holding it in one hand like it's a suitcase, and that just gets across how big and powerful brutes are, even when compared to Spartans. And finally, while Kai is unresponsive on the ground, Chief and Marquis finally come into contact with one another, and that is where it's left. This was a fantastic episode and was literally quintessential Halo. It felt so much like Halo. The battle scenes, the pacing, it just everything lined up, and I hope we see a lot more of this going forward. But you've got to bear in mind that Season 1 is behind the scenes. It's done. It's been recorded, it's gone through post-production, it's been edited, it's been finalised, and it's now being released week by week. That means that ultimately whatever has been done in Season 1 is done. So criticisms, things we don't like, things we do like, this, that and the other, the likelihood is that they're listening. But we're not going to see these changes until at least Season 2, if they intend on implementing these changes. But nevertheless, if we can get more of this, I mean, I've loved the TV series so far anyway. I've loved it because I've accepted it for what it is. I've accepted the fact that it's a different, it's a different lore. I've accepted the fact that it's going a different way because the story has to be told in a slightly different way because it's not a game. But the episode 5 was just creme de la creme. The fighting scene in particular, just seeing raw Spartan power on display, really good. If you haven't seen this episode yet, you need to. And while I'm trying to lean away from doing just straight breakdowns, this episode was just so good that I had to at least give something of a breakdown to these fight scenes. So I don't know. Well, I've got more videos coming, some of them surrounding certain plot points, so they're not like episodic based, they're more the general narrative based, but all of that's on its way, so I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, commenting, liking and subscribing. I just want to give a quick shout out to my patrons and YouTube members: Spartan10148, my Metarch; Dylan, Falcon X003, Kenwood, Irrefutable Justice, Leon, Neek and Ramiz, my monitors; Alvin, Andrew, Brand, Brian, Cameron, Chris, Darian, Devon, Flaming Halo, Greenblood, Kyle, Legions Lost, Michael, Prophet Bear, Spartan and Wolf, my sub-monitors; my fleet of Strato Sentinels; my diligent enforcers, and all the other awesome people that have jumped aboard to support the channel over at Patreon. Another shout out to Todd Morrison, my Transcendent YouTube member. And just one quick reminder to support us on all major social media channels, including Discord. Much love from 00. Take it easy everyone, and find peace in the domain.